In 1933, the death rate in Soviet Ukraine reached levels unprecedented in peacetime European history. An estimated 28,000 people were dying every single day, not from war, not from epidemic disease, but from starvation in one of the most fertile agricultural regions on Earth. Soviet archives opened after the collapse of the USSR revealed something extraordinary. Throughout this period of mass death, government grain reserves contained enough food to feed over 10 million people. The Soviet Union was simultaneously exporting millions of tons of grain to Western Europe while its own citizens starved. This was the Holodomor, a famine that killed approximately 4 million Ukrainians between 1932 and 1933. For more than 50 years, the Soviet government denied it happened. This is the documented history of how an entire nation was brought to the edge of destruction and why the world heard almost nothing about it. To understand how this nightmare became possible, you need to know what Ukraine represented to Stalin in 1932. Ukraine wasn't just another Soviet republic. It was the Soviet Union's agricultural powerhouse, the fertile black soil region that produced more grain than anywhere else in Europe. But more than that, Ukraine had something Stalin feared: a national identity, a language, a culture, a history of resistance to Russian domination that stretched back centuries. In the 1920s, Soviet authorities had actually encouraged Ukrainian culture. The policy was called Ukrainianization: local language in schools, Ukrainian books in libraries, national traditions celebrated openly. It was designed to win Ukrainian support for the communist regime. It worked. Ukrainian intellectuals, writers, and teachers flourished. The Ukrainian national spirit grew stronger, not weaker. But by 1929, Stalin had consolidated absolute power in Moscow, and he had a problem. His grand plan to transform the Soviet Union into an industrial superpower required grain, massive amounts of grain to export for hard currency, and grain to feed industrial workers in the cities. The only place to get that grain was Ukraine. Stalin's solution was forced collectivization. Peasant farmers who had worked their own land for generations would be forced to give up their property and join collective farms, kolkhozes, where the state controlled everything. Individual ownership would cease to exist. Ukrainian farmers resisted. Of course they resisted. These were people whose identity was rooted in their land, their villages, their independence. When communist agitators arrived demanding they surrender their farms, many refused. Some hid grain. Some killed their livestock rather than hand them over. A few organized armed resistance. Stalin saw this resistance as a direct threat to Soviet power. And he wasn't entirely wrong. If Ukraine successfully resisted collectivization, other regions might follow. The whole Soviet system could unravel. So, Stalin made a decision. He would use hunger as a weapon. Not just to collect grain, not just to enforce collectivization, but to break the Ukrainian spirit permanently. To destroy the kulaks, the slightly wealthier peasants who formed the backbone of Ukrainian village life. To eliminate Ukrainian nationalism by eliminating Ukrainians. The man Stalin sent to enforce this policy was a bureaucrat named Lazar Kaganovich. Stalin's instructions to him were chilling in their clarity. Ukraine's grain quotas for 1932 were set impossibly high: 356 million poods of grain. That's roughly 5.8 million tons. Ukraine had never produced that much, even in the best years, and 1932 wasn't a good year. But the quotas weren't about what Ukraine could produce. They were about what Stalin wanted to take. When Ukrainian officials protested that the quotas were impossible to meet, Stalin sent a telegram that would doom millions. 2 sentences. Ukraine's grain quota must be met. Use any means necessary. Any means necessary. That's what transformed a harvest shortage into genocide. August 8, 1932. Stalin signed a decree that would become known as the Law of Five Stalks. The official title was longer and more bureaucratic, but every Ukrainian knew what it meant. If you were caught taking even a handful of grain from a collective farm field, even grain you had grown yourself, you could be shot or sent to a labor camp for 10 years for theft of socialist property. A child picking up fallen wheat stalks to feed their starving family, 10 years, or execution. The confiscation brigades arrived in Ukrainian villages like locusts. Teams of communist activists, backed by police and military units, went house to house. They weren't looking for excess grain, they were looking for any grain. All grain. A survivor named Stefan Horlach described what happened when they came to his village. They had long metal poles, like spears, but for probing. They would poke them into the ground, into hay piles, into walls. They were looking for buried grain. If they found any, they took it. If they didn't find any, they took the furniture, the cooking pots, anything of value as punishment for hiding grain. The activists knew exactly where to look because they were often from the same villages, neighbors turning on neighbors. Not because they believed in the cause, most didn't, but because activists received food rations while everyone else starved. The regime understood human desperation and weaponized it. Maria Fearman watched her mother beaten for picking up grain stalks from a field after harvest. The brigadier had a stick. He hit my mother across the back. She fell down. He kept hitting her. My sister and I were screaming, but what could we do? We were children. By December 1932, the confiscation was complete in most villages. Everything edible was gone. Not just grain, potatoes, beets, beans, livestock, even pets disappeared into the cooking pots before those too were confiscated. One survivor recalled, "They took the cow, then they took the pig, then they took the chickens. Then they came back and took the leather off our plow harness to meet their quota. What were we supposed to eat? Dirt?" As famine began spreading through Ukrainian villages in late 1932, desperate people did what humans have always done in times of starvation. They tried to leave. They walked to cities looking for bread. They attempted to cross into Russia or Belarus where food was available. Stalin couldn't allow this. If Ukrainians escaped and told the world what was happening, if they survived to remain a political threat, the entire operation would fail. On January 22, 1933, Stalin and his chief deputy Vyacheslav Molotov signed a secret directive. It created an internal passport system and explicitly forbade peasants from leaving Ukraine or the Kuban region, another area with a large Ukrainian population. No other Soviet republic received this restriction. GPU, the secret police, set up checkpoints at railways and regional borders. During March 1933 alone, they intercepted 219,460 people trying to escape the famine zone. Most were forcibly returned to their starving villages. Some were arrested. Some disappeared into the Gulag labor camp system. Maria Tilna remembered the desperation. People tried to board trains. The police would pull them off. You could see them at the stations, just lying there, too weak to move. The police would check for travel documents. If you didn't have the right papers, back to the village, to die. Ukraine had become a prison. 22 million people locked inside a territory where food had been systematically removed and no escape was possible. The death trap was complete. Spring should have brought relief. Spring meant planting, meant hope, meant the cycle of life continuing. Spring 1933 brought only death. A survivor named Alexandra Yamnyuk was a university student in Kharkiv, Ukraine's second-largest city. She described walking to classes. The corpses were in the streets. in doorways, on the sidewalks. Every morning there were more. The city sent wagons to collect them. They would pile the bodies on carts and take them away, like collecting garbage. In June 1933, mortality peaked. 28,000 people died every day.
Every day. That's 1,168 people every hour. 20 people every minute. In the time it takes you to watch this video, roughly 300 Ukrainians died of starvation. The survivors' testimonies describe scenes that sound impossible. A coachman assigned to collect corpses from homes would arrive at a house, look at the dying family and say to the father, "Let me take your wife too. By the time I reach the cemetery, she'll be dead anyway. Save me a second trip." Parents had to choose which children to feed, knowing others would die. A 10-year-old named Klavdia recalled her dying sister's final words. "Klavdia, give me some milk. Mummy, please give me something to eat." There was nothing to give. We walked around like skeletons. Our bodies were swollen and glowing. We looked like we'd been pumped full of air. People ate anything. Grass, tree bark, leather, cats, dogs. There are documented cases of cannibalism, parents driven insane by watching their children starve. These cases were prosecuted viciously by Soviet authorities, not because of moral outrage, but because acknowledging them meant acknowledging the famine existed. Here's the most damning detail. While Ukrainians were dying at a rate of 28,000 per day, Soviet records showed that government grain reserves contained enough food to feed over 10 million people for a year. The grain sat in warehouses. Some of it rotted. The Soviet Union continued exporting grain to Europe throughout 1932 and 1933, 4.27 million tons in 1932 alone, enough to feed 12 million people. The famine wasn't happening because there was no food. It was happening because the food was being deliberately withheld. While millions died, the Soviet propaganda machine worked overtime to deny the famine existed. Foreign journalists who tried to report on the starvation were expelled from the Soviet Union or denied access to Ukraine. The few who managed to see the truth and report it, like Welsh journalist Gareth Jones, were discredited by Soviet sympathizers in the West. Walter Duranty, the New York Times Moscow correspondent, wrote article after article denying famine reports. His infamous line, "There is no actual starvation, but there is widespread mortality due to malnutrition." He won a Pulitzer Prize for his coverage. He also had a cozy relationship with Soviet authorities who gave him exclusive access in exchange for favorable coverage. The Soviet government didn't just deny the famine, they made discussing it illegal. Ukrainians who spoke about starvation were arrested for anti-Soviet agitation. The word famine couldn't be mentioned. Death certificates were falsified. Instead of starvation, they listed exhaustion or disease or left the cause blank. International aid organizations offered help. The Red Cross, religious charities, Ukrainian diaspora communities raised money and tried to send food. Stalin refused all aid. Officially, there was no famine, so no aid was needed. Accepting aid would mean admitting the famine existed. This wasn't incompetence. This wasn't bureaucratic bungling. This was a conscious, coordinated effort to starve millions while telling the world nothing was wrong. The famine finally subsided in late 1933 after that year's harvest was collected, not because Stalin's policies changed, because there was nothing left to take, and keeping the killing going would have interfered with agricultural production. The demographic catastrophe was staggering. Conservative estimates put the death toll at 3.9 million Ukrainians. Some historians argue it was closer to 5 million or more when you account for unregistered deaths and census manipulation.
But Stalin's attack on Ukraine didn't end with the famine. In parallel with the starvation, he had been dismantling Ukrainian culture. Ukrainian intellectuals, writers, teachers, clergy, artists were arrested in massive numbers. The Ukrainian autocephalous Orthodox Church was liquidated entirely in 1930, its priests sent to labor camps. By the end of the 1930s, 4/5 of Ukrainians' cultural elite had been repressed, executed, or died in camps. Those who survived learned to never speak of the famine. Parents didn't tell their children. Teachers didn't mention it in schools. The very word Holodomor couldn't be spoken. For decades, Ukraine existed under a forced amnesia. An entire generation grew up not knowing that millions of their grandparents' generation had been deliberately starved to death. The Soviet regime had achieved something totalitarians dream of. They had erased history while people who remembered it were still alive. The truth began to emerge in the late 1980s when Mikhail Gorbachev's glasnost policy allowed Ukrainians to finally speak about their past. In 1989, a Ukrainian journalist named Volodymyr Manyak put out a simple call. If you survived the Holodomor, tell your story. The response was overwhelming. Thousands of testimonies poured in. Old men and women who had stayed silent for 50 years finally broke down and spoke about the children they'd watched die, the neighbors they'd buried, the hunger that never fully left them. One survivor, Z.S. Bilash, described watching people in his village simply sit down and die. On the streets you'd see them, mostly children. They'd be sitting there, then they'd fall over. Nobody could help. Everyone was dying. The testimonies revealed details the Soviet archives had hidden. The confiscation brigades, the blocked borders, the activists who knew exactly which families had hidden a sack of grain because they were from the same village, the mass graves dug in every cemetery, pits so large they could hold hundreds of bodies. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991 and Ukraine became independent, archives opened, documents emerged, Stalin's telegrams, Molotov's directives, the grain quotas, the secret decree closing the borders, the orders to confiscate all food. The paper trail was damning. These weren't mistakes. These weren't the unintended consequences of bad policy. These were deliberate, methodical decisions designed to break Ukrainian resistance through mass starvation. In 2006, Ukraine officially recognized the Holodomor as genocide. The European Parliament followed in 2022. As of 2025, more than 30 countries have recognized it as genocide, including the United States, Canada, Australia, and most of Europe. But recognition is still debated. Russia continues to insist the famine was a tragedy that affected many Soviet regions, not a targeted attack on Ukrainians. They point to other areas that experienced famine, like Kazakhstan. And they're not wrong that other areas suffered, but the policies applied specifically to Ukraine were unique. The border closures, the blackboard punishment villages, where literally everything was confiscated, the parallel destruction of Ukrainian culture. Historian Timothy Snyder identified 7 specific policies that were applied only or primarily to Ukraine during the famine. Each one, individually, might look like an administrative decision. Together, they created conditions designed to cause maximum death. Raphael Lemkin, the man who literally coined the word genocide and authored the UN Genocide Convention, studied the Holodomor in the 1950s. His conclusion: this was the classic example of Soviet genocide, an attempt to destroy not just individuals, but the Ukrainian nation itself. Whether you call it genocide or not, the facts are clear. Stalin's regime created artificial famine conditions, prevented escape, confiscated all food, refused international aid, and then denied the famine existed while millions died. The death toll, conservatively 3.9 million, possibly much higher, represents one of the worst crimes of the 20th century. And for 50 years, this crime was barely known to the world. The Holodomor left scars that still haven't healed. The villages were never the same. Stalin ordered ethnic Russians moved into depopulated Ukrainian villages to resettle them. The traditional Ukrainian village, the center of Ukrainian culture for centuries, was essentially destroyed. The language, the customs, the folk traditions that had survived foreign occupation and Russian imperialism couldn't survive Stalin's engineered famine. The survivors carried trauma that shaped the rest of their lives. Food hoarding became common. People who survived the famine would keep excessive food stores until they died, terrified of starvation returning. Survivors reported food disgust. Certain foods they'd been forced to eat during the famine, like grass soup or boiled leather, would make them physically ill decades later. The generational trauma passed down to children and grandchildren who never experienced the famine themselves. Second and third generation descendants report anxiety around food scarcity, compulsive behaviors around not wasting food, and psychological impacts from growing up with parents who couldn't speak about their trauma. Ukraine's relationship with Russia has been shaped by the Holodomor in ways that directly connect to today. The famine is why Ukrainians view Russian denials of their suffering as a continuation of Soviet-era oppression. It's why Ukrainian independence in 1991 mattered so much, a chance to control their own fate, their own food, their own story. And, tragically, the Holodomor has echoes in Russia's current war against Ukraine. Russian forces have deliberately targeted Ukrainian grain infrastructure, storage facilities, ports, agricultural equipment. The tactic of using food as a weapon didn't die with Stalin. It evolved. The memorialization of the Holodomor in Ukraine is powerful and deliberate. Every fourth Saturday in November is Holodomor Remembrance Day. At 4 p.m., across Ukraine, people light candles and observe a moment of silence. The Holodomor Museum in Kyiv preserves testimonies and documents. Monuments stand in villages across Ukraine, many marking mass graves. But perhaps the most important legacy is this: the world now knows. For 70 years, this crime was hidden, denied, erased from history. Today,
Russia continues its aggression against Ukraine. Understanding the Holodomor matters more than ever. This isn't ancient history. This is context for why Ukrainians fight so hard for independence, why they see Russian imperialism as an existential threat. The Holodomor taught them, when someone tries to destroy your nation, you resist or you disappear. If you want to understand how Stalin rose to absolute power and created the system that made the Holodomor possible, the next video covers his purges of the Communist Party itself, how he eliminated anyone who could challenge him. Click here to see how paranoia became policy.